Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start. We would have started earlier if that preacher wasn't so long-winded. Who was that guy?
Hear it for the preacher.
I was going to say something, I won't. I'm so glad you all are here. There are still some seats up here, so come forward, and there's seats on the side. Ray Gindros is, I said to the vestry the other night, if you don't believe in the grace of God, you do believe, then you really are blind, because it was the grace of God that brought Ray Gindros here, and we are taking the next step. Please give him some applause. And I also want to say the grace of God that has some other folks here. He has a wonderful team. Molly over here. And Brittany and Andy, where are you? Raffin? And who else? Yes, Tobin Palmer. And Peter Oberly. Where's Peter? Awesome. And Ken Reynolds. Where's Ken? Right over there. This is a tremendous team that are working with Ray. The Lord be with you. Loving and gracious God, your grace is sufficient, and your grace is leading us forward. As we listen today, and as we listen to our own hearts, and as we use our eyes of faith, help us to look ahead, engage our imaginations, and keep our hearts joyful as we continue the road to our own Emmaus. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming. We have a lot of people here. This is fantastic. Thank you. There are some empty seats at the tables. Come on, come forward, everybody. Don't hide back in the shadows. This is an interactive session. There are going to be 3 discussion periods. I'm going to present a little bit of information, and then there'll be discussion, more information, more discussion, more information, more discussion. And the title up here, I think, is important to set the tone for it. The purpose of this session is to continue to improve what we now have, but also to plan for the future. So the first question is, when is the future? It's like, are we there yet, Daddy? And the answer is we don't know yet, but we know if we don't have a plan for the future, we'll never get anywhere. And so we are now about to embark on a new master plan. So in the course of this session today, we have 3 parts. Very Trinitarian, I guess, or like Gaul, it's divided into 3 parts. The first part is a presentation of 2 things. A brief overview of what we did last year, and reporting back to you of the input that we've received so far from both the large meeting that we had here at the end of February and a series of focus group meetings. We're going to ask you to review those results, which include things that people like best, things that people like least, and what some of the needs are. But we're going to do this in a little bit different way. We're going to ask you to, in the first session, to look at a list that we've generated of needs which will require some form of larger scale construction than we can do out of the annual budget. So that would set a big picture. The second part will be to begin to explore at least one possibility or several possibilities for a master plan for the facilities of the parish house itself. In doing so, we will look to the past, first of all. I have to tell you, as an architect and an urban planner, every time I came into a situation in which there had been a history of very sincere planning efforts done by very talented and accomplished people that had not been realized, I got very nervous. Very nervous. What happened? What's going on? It's not so important to understand what happened as a matter of history, but it's important to glean some lessons from that. I'm actually full of admiration for all the previous plans that were done here. I've studied them, and our team has studied them. And there are things to be proud of in them, and there are lessons to be learned, so it's not in any way lost effort. There may have been disappointments when they weren't realized, but they're not lost efforts. One very important principle is to be able to work within the constraints that a site has. And particularly given the recent history, we know that our property is bound by various zoning requirements, historic district requirements, which have an impact on what we will be able to do. We need to know those up front, and I'm going to present them to you and some of the impacts of that. And then from that, we have developed a possible approach for you to react to. So at the end of that, we're going to ask you 3 questions, all under the general heading, what makes sense to you about this possibility? And then we will return to the results of the process we've had for the short-term shopping list. Now last year, this is so true confession time, last year when we had the session with the shopping list, I never imagined that it would turn into an auction. We called it a shopping list simply so we could determine priorities and how to spend the money that we've got. This year, we're not going to turn it into an auction. I mean, if you want to spontaneously erupt, it's all right, but we're not going to consciously turn it into an auction because we do have some budgets. This is tied to, through the junior warden's work and through Ken Reynolds' work, it's tied, and Molly McCune's work, it's tied into some of the ongoing budgets. So this is an opportunity to feed into the decisions that need to be made about how to spend the money that we already have. So we will look at a short-term shopping list and we'll ask you to pick some priorities. Tell us what you think is most important. Now, can we turn the lights out? Is that possible? Anybody know? Okay, great. It's always important to put the audience in the dark at the beginning of one of these, sessions. So the first thing I'd like to do is rehearse a little bit what we did last year. We had a DOT process and big parish meeting in February. We had a meeting almost the same week in May in which we reviewed those results. And then after that, we worked with an architect to come up with some specific proposals. We met in July to pick the items that were to be done. Most of them got accomplished in the short-term list, and the work was finished by the end of October. Now that was like grease lightning for most processes. We're now moving into a different phase in which it's going to take a little bit longer to get things done. We hope to get the short-term list done on the same schedule, but the larger scale things are going to take some more time. So the process, as you, I hope, will well remember, had people putting green dots on the things that were good, red dots on the things that were bad, blue dots on the things that were most important to improve, and that included improving the exterior appearance of Lloyd Hall and the connections between the church and Lloyd Hall, and things like the rails in the sanctuary. So what happened? Well, this is a before and after image. The image at the top is what it was like. I presented this to you in the session last year. Do you remember that? And now is what it looked like 2 days ago. So this reveals an important principle in the practice of architecture. You always take your before photographs on a rainy and dreary day and your after photographs on a bright sunny one. And one of the things that I find most interesting about the wonderful advice we had from Robin Thomas, the architect, is that with the use of color, she managed to take our complex and make it look like an institutional complex. It feels like an institution. And certainly, the transformation from what it looked like to what it is now was astonishing. Now that's possible. That was possible because everybody was on the same page. We all came together and we wanted to do the same thing. It's a collective effort. And in my career, I know that the only way major things get done is when everybody is rowing the boat in the same direction. Of course, inside, there was a little bit of change too, with the transformation from the corridor as it was to what it is now, which is really a restoration of some of the architecture of the original. Now, you may remember that we had a very, very long list a very long shopping list. The items in green are short-term projects which were accomplished. But we knew that we couldn't do certain long-term things. And so those are in red. And those are still with us. And our process today was to explore and test that same list, but to see if the list changed with the new process. They include things like fix squishy wood floors and replace tile in the church where the pews used to be and are no longer. Has a lot to do with an elevator and better circulation system. Has a lot to do with gathering spaces, with better meeting spaces to come together. So, on to the process that we've done so far. We began on February 16th, and then we had a series of meetings with focus groups who are people representing the various service organizations who love and serve this parish so well. We thought it was extremely important to get direct input from all of these groups. So instead of dots, because we used the dots less, because it was a lot of discussion, we developed some diagrams in which those things which people thought were good are green. Those things which people thought were problems and not so good are pink. Maybe it's too cheerful a color, but anyway, they're sort of pink color. And those places like Lloyd Hall, where there are a lot of good things, but there are also some problems, got Brooks Brothers striped tie treatment as a way of articulating it. So I'm going to just describe briefly what some of these are. The squishy floors in the, it's very high tech here. The squishy floors at the front of the church, coupled with a curious dark spot in the lighting system, which manages during performances to have the only people not lit be the performers, which is not a particularly good situation. More squishy floors at the back, unsightly in this case because where the pews were removed. And generally some issues around lighting. There were longer term issues, such as adding a cross aisle, rearranging the pews, repairing the pews and the kneelers and the floors under the pews. This is really a long-term project because you have to do it all at once. You can't do it in pieces. You have to take everything up, move it out, and get it all refinished. So it moves into the long-term category. The people who work on flowers and in the sacristy and in the vesting areas are still very cramped and crowded. We had one major victory. We got the coffee machine out, which was a big cause of, it sounds like a little thing, but in terms of all the clutter, was a big thing. And that the drinking fountain place now is St. Arbuck's Chapel. So you'll see that there's a Keurig machine back in that for use during the week. And there actually is a St. Arbuck's neon sign that Wynn provided for us. That's right in there. So it's amazing. See, that's what happens when you get everybody involved. All these ideas come bubbling up. The most disliked item, I'd say this year, is the stair that goes from the basement all the way up to the children's floor. The riser tread ratio is too steep. There is no elevator. It's difficult for young and old alike. And you'll see a little later on that there's one missing ingredient that would help it a great deal. There is no handrail on the outside perimeter of it, which means that when fast kids and slow kids are going up, there's no way of controlling them or channeling them. And Charlie Davy, when we talked about adding a rail, got very excited because she could see how to organize that to eliminate that as a hazard for young children. The choir, similarly, has a kind of objection to that, particularly for people who are less than fully mobile. And almost every user group felt that this was a problem. So clearly, in the long term, an elevator and new stairs are very important. In Lloyd Hall, the women's bathrooms continue to be one of the most popular items to throw darts at. Some suggestions of improvements with audiovisual equipment, storage, backstairs, and kitchen are also thought to be needed. Up on the second floor, we had a long and very creative session with folks associated with that. There is great distress that the children's area, particularly the nursery, is up on what is called the third floor. It's actually the second floor, but it's an indication of the perception of how far it is up as an inappropriate place for the children's program. And we looked at the possibility in the short term of moving it to the lower part of Lloyd Hall, but after pretty careful consideration, recognized that the investment required would be far in excess of the funds that are available to be able to do that. So we need to, so that moves to a long-term list, and we need to muddle forward and make the best of what we have up there. There is a shortage of space, and so one idea is to use rooms that are not used very much into one room that's more visible and accessible. So these are some of the issues that came up. And of course, down in the basement, the choir is stuck down there with all the dust and dirt that accumulates. The stairs are a problem. In the lower part of Lloyd Hall, the spaces are used quite well by the outreach groups. There's clearly some concern about their physical condition, but the biggest issue is in a process that revealed over and over and over again a pressing need for managing storage. It became clear that having something as mundane as storage could be the most important thing we do, because it clears up space up in the main floors that can be used for some of the spaces that we no longer have. So you will have on your table in front of you a sheet that looks like this for the ground floor that has on it a list of what we like and what we don't like. And we have on the other side what we like least. And then you'll have a similar sheet for the upper and lower floors. But before we turn you loose on that, you've got a much more difficult assignment in the next 15 minutes. And that is that we, let me zoom forward. We have taken this and translated it into a set of needs. So there are some small-scale projects that we can do within our budget. There are large-scale projects which is going to take a capital campaign and a lot of effort. But we have to plan for it. We would like you to first discuss the needs as they relate to the larger scale efforts. And let me quickly run through what we heard. We've organized these needs by the three first principles of our mission statement. And you know, every vestry meeting begins with these mission statements. We are to be a welcoming and caring community, offering hospitality to all, practicing thoughtful pastoral care and strategic outreach, insightful preaching and teaching, awe-inspiring liturgical and musical experiences. These are the three pillars of our mission statement. So how are we doing with the facility? Well, what you need with that to be welcoming is a clear central welcoming space where everybody comes to the same place, knows how to get to the various facilities, and finds their way around easily. We need a place where you can easily go from the church to the reception hall, where you're not going to lose people. We need vertical circulation. We're a multi-level building. We have got to get up and down somehow, and those are bigger cost items. There is a need, this is partly from the community side and partly internal, for a human presence on Stockley Gardens. We need a reception space for both large and small events, a space that's flexible, that can open out into other spaces as opposed to having to accommodate the full range of needs themselves. This space is used by many, many different functions, sometimes effectively, some not, but we can't do a reception for more than about 120 here. There's a rule that if a room appears to be 80% full, a lot of people will turn away and not come in. So it doesn't mean you need one single big space. It means you need a series of spaces that can be open and combined from one to the other. A parlor, clearly, has been talked about a lot, but also in the process emerged the need for a library, a boardroom, and small meeting areas. And after trying to find places to have meetings here, I began to think that if we just built 5 parlors and 3 boardrooms, we might accommodate everything that we need. In insightful teaching, clearly the children's program needs to be larger. The sort of norm of 50 square foot per student with the current population very often at 50 would suggest that you need 2,500 square feet. We've got about 1,500 up there. If we go to 75 students, it's 3,800 square feet. So clearly a larger facility is needed for that. Several comfortable meeting rooms and a large assembly room that works very well. In the awe-inspiring liturgical and musical experience category, we do need consolidated choir facilities. You know, Kevin's library is upstairs, his office is over here upstairs, everybody else is down in the basement, and they rehearse in Lloyd Hall. So it's all over the place. It's not coherent in a way, and given our emphasis, that's important. Music education spaces is something new that's happening because that's a program that's expanding. And then our friends who try to struggle with a sacristy that's too small, a vesting area that's all mixed up with flowers, need new and better workspace. And then there are repair, replace the pews, and enhance the worship space. So your assignment is to review the list of best like and least like and add any additional items, and then take a look at these list of needs, which you've got in front of you, and tell us what is missing from the list, what should not be on the list, what are the 5 most important items. There are usually 2 facilitators at each table who will conduct the discussion. Let's see if we can do this in 10 minutes. We can run over if we have to, but let's see if we can do it in 10 minutes. Okay, so let's now move on to the hard stuff. So the more complicated issues. If we're close with this list of needs that are going to take some kind of construction, how do we do it? And what is the best way to develop a master plan? And I want to reinforce some of the things that we heard over and over again, which is this whole notion of a central gathering place that brings the whole church together spontaneously as a way of reinforcing a sense of community. This is not something that was common in churches 50, 60, 70 years ago, but increasingly it's the way in which churches establish the permanent community that will carry on from generation to generation. And that keeps emerging. I mean, sure, there's more children's space needed, more classroom space needed, better reception space needed, but if there's anything that seems, in all of the conversations, it's that idea. So how do we do it? Well, I do think that history will tell us a lot. We look at the building we now have, building complex that we now have, and we look for that kind of central gathering space, and it's not there in any way, shape, or form. It's simply not there. The argument has been made that the particularly narrow and tortuous route from the church to the parish hall is actually good for social interaction, and you bump into people and start conversations while you're waiting in line. But that's not quite the spirit of togetherness that we think that seems to be important. And so we have this curious arrangement where our only disabled access to the parish house is through the church, up the ramp, in and then up another ramp to Lloyd Hall. Nothing from other directions. So this whole notion of being accessible and open simply isn't there. And the notion of an expandable reception area that opens from area to area to area simply isn't here. Even in proposals that expanded it to the full footprint of the building did not provide that kind of flexibility. So those are some of the issues. So let's learn from the past. Brittany, I think it was Brittany and Andy Raffin, during the big clean out 2.5 years ago, excavated a plan which apparently very few people knew about. At least every time we've showed it to people, it's been a surprise. It was done in 1947. Now, it's not the first effort to expand the parish house complex. Just to review the history, the church itself was built in 1908, and that included a one-story element right here like this, which was the sacristy and rector's office. In 1918, the rest of the parish house was added, including a second floor. And then after the merger with St. Luke's, there was a plan in 1936 to extend the parish house in this direction. The finances weren't there, the war came along, and then the next effort was in 1947. This plan was designed by the successor firm to the original architects for the church. And they created a cloister walk. So you would come out of the church with both of those double doors being open to you, up some steps, and across a cloister walk, another entrance and exit on de Boissevain, and then access to a suite of offices and meeting rooms going up towards Stockley Garden. Now the program, of course, was very different. This, for example, was the women's auxiliary room, complete with kitchen and chapel. This was the choir room, the women's choir room, and the nursery. So it's a different program and layout. There was a basement with all sorts of classrooms, and there were meeting rooms and performance spaces up on the second floor that opened into the existing parish house. So it's an elegant and very beautiful plan. Simple, straightforward. You could see how it would work. Fits nicely on the site. A little crowded here up against the Pelham Apartments, but still there's a little bit of a garden there to make it work. Now, one of the great lessons from this is what it looked like. I hope you can see this. This is all we don't have much records of it. But this is an elevation drawing. This is the church, the back of the church. This is the portion of the parish house that comes out to Stockley Gardens, looking very much like a Ghent house. And then this is the cloister walk set back on the garden that connects the architecture of the church. So you can see it's a very beautiful complex. And I dare say there'd be no problem getting community approval for something like this. So it shows us the merit of a couple, yes, I know. Thank you. So it shows us the merit of being responsive to the context and also the merit of comportment. The church is still the largest building, and the parish house is subordinate and supports that. So those are lessons that we can take away from this. However, times have changed. We no longer have things like women's auxiliary and separate chapels. But in addition to that, this still did not deal with this very 21st century notion of the central common gathering space. It was still just a walkway and a cloister. It also rammed right into the historic building of the parish house. So this was before much of the historic district legislation. We are very interested in exploring ways of using tax credit financing for restoration of the parish house and the church, which will be a great relief to our own cost burdens on this project. But to do that, you need to conform to a set of guidelines, Section 6 at the state level. And one of the things that is quite desirable is to actually free up these facades and have something separated, the new construction from the old, just as the Slover Library does downtown, has that atrium, and it uses tax credit for financing it. You can do it for nonprofits and for churches. It's not just for commercial developments. We didn't get that. What do we have? Well, what did we get? In 1950, Lloyd Hall was built, and the rectory was turned into the Guild House with its meeting rooms and offices, including offices for the bishop, with a connection between Lloyd Hall and the Guild House. Now, as someone who never saw this, only looking at it in plan and listening to people's conversations about it, there are lots of positive associations with some of the rooms in the Guild House. But there is also lots of conversation about what it took to get there from the church. And in looking at the plans, this strikes me as being a collection of separate outdoor addresses, that the parish house is one, the church is one, the Guild House was another, and Lloyd Hall is another. They really are separate things that are connected essentially by a back door. You went through the kitchen to get there. Or here, originally, the choir room was this big, so you had to go through the choir room to get to the steps to get up to Lloyd Hall. So back to this notion of tying everything together with a single space, this was not a priority in those days and times. It was a collection of separate places with backdoor connections. Now, John Paul Hanbury, in 1991, is an architect who I knew and admired a great deal, tried to make a connection between the parish house, Lloyd Hall, and the Guild House. He apparently, I never spoke to him about it, but I've talked to others who have, he considered it a nearly impossible task. And although he did come up with a design, what you see about it is that the gymnastics, given handicap access requirements and other fire code regulations, became not a glue, a kind of glue that holds everything together, but a kind of labyrinth that's almost an obstacle for it. So, for instance, all of this is ramp going up to get up to the level in order to get up to this level, and then this is a ramp to go down and find your way into the Guild House. So in terms of today's needs, not in terms of what it was then, but in terms of today's needs, this demonstrates for us how difficult working with this building is. And every plan we've seen turns itself into a pretzel, trying to cope with a building which is in the wrong place, at the wrong floor level, with the wrong kind of space. And so this leads us to a conclusion that we'd like to test on you today, that this building has got to go. Has got to go. Because it's in the way, we're going to spend so much more money working around it than we would if it were a clean slate. And the property committee has thought about this for a long time and has come to that as a recommendation to the parish to do it. And John Paul was a very good architect, and I'm a great admirer of his creativity, and he couldn't make it work in our terms. So as I said, every time I come into a situation where there have been projects that have been realized, you have to look at what the root cause is, and that is the root cause of that problem. Now, there was, of course, the Barton Myers plan, but there are several plans by Barton Myers. There's a whole series of them. There's a book of 8 plans. I also knew Barton Myers as a colleague many years ago and also admire his skills as an architect. And he came up with an idea which I think is very instructive to us. This is one of the earlier schemes. It's not the final one with the big glass atrium on Stockley Gardens. But it was one of the plans that put a kind of atrium space along the face of the parish house. Again, just like the Slover Library is doing. So that the historic building is revealed and that space becomes open circulation with a glass roof on top of it. In that way, you get daylight into the rooms in the parish house instead of blocking up the openings, and you create a clear circulation element. Now, of course, there are lots of things that didn't work about the Barton Myers various plans. They were way too big. They had a program that's very different, too big for our terms, and maybe for budget terms. They had a very different program. There was a whole theater program. There was the notion of a preschool, all sorts of things that were part of that very ambitious effort. And we're in a very different time now. We now know that our needs are relatively modest, critical, but relatively modest in terms of square footage. And of course, the whole architectural issues with its relationship to the neighborhood were also things that caused it not to be realized. Okay, so that's some lessons about history and maybe helps us understand how we got to where we are right now. Moving forward, a couple things we need to keep in mind. The city has a flood zoning legislation which is relatively recent, passed in the past year. No new construction to be occupied by human beings and furniture is permitted any lower than the level of the existing parish house. So we cannot build a basement as new space. We cannot do it. We can make an argument for reinforcing the floodproofing of the parish house as a historic building on the lower level. Ray Norton said to me earlier that John Paul's suggestion was to fill the basement with sand. We may do that. That's another possibility for it to do it. But that limits us. Now, in addition, we're in a historic district with historic zoning requirements. There is yes, someone's going to rescue me from a little Harry Carey in public up here. But we have in the historic zoning a requirement that we cannot cover more than 55% of the ground with a building footprint. Okay, I personally don't agree with that legislation, but it's the law, so we have to respect it. We cannot cover more of the ground than 55%, total for all our buildings. We cannot be higher than 35 feet, yes?
What percentage do we cover now?
I'll come back down to that. Good question, I'll come to that. We cannot go higher than 35 feet. So here we are. We can only go so wide. We have to start up off the ground, and we can't go very high. So,
No exceptions.
I'll come to that. We have to make a case. We have to make a case. We have to make a case for it. Now, the last project went through several court hearings and hearings by a judge who Marilyn and I had dinner with last night. It was very curious. Anyway, it was very funny. It was very funny. Anyway, the key is how you conform to these rules. Now, many people have asked about the reconstruction of the Guild House. Is that still a requirement? Thanks to Rod's excellent research last year, it is not a requirement. Now, it was a requirement as a condition for building the previous project. Saving the materials.
Promise to get neighborhood that we were going to do that?
Pardon?
Didn't we promise to get neighborhood league that we were going to do that?
As part of that project. As part of that project. It's no longer a requirement. The second thing about that was preserving the materials.
That's really true, Ray.
Pardon?
That's really not true. To get league will go along with not producing the Guild House.
Good.
Because It's been such a long time before anything happened. I've talked to him personally.
Oh, good. Thank you, Freddie. That's good.
I think we went over and had him introduced to him. We never got together. But that's a circumstance. Now, the city, they promised the city that it would be rebuilt or replicated. Now, that didn't happen. So I guess the city would not push that any further.
Well, here's...
But the Ghent League did say if they try to go...
Did everybody hear that? That the Ghent League has, in Freddie's conversation with them, is no longer pushing for that as an absolute requirement. But I do have a response.
But they did say that if they went above the height that what my plan was, they would really fight that.
Yes, okay. So this comes back to the constraints. We stick to the height, we stick to the footprint, we may be able to get a variance, but the key is this. The key is this. I've talked to a number of people at the city and in the Ghent community about the whole issue there, and I think Freddie has really articulated it very well. The Guild House was a symbol of something, and Stockley Gardens is a park that's so close to the houses that it's almost like a front yard for the houses. That type of park relies on the presence of houses along it for safety and security. And the Guild House had offices in it, people in it, looked like a house, and over again, people tell me what made people so upset was that the character of the community, which is this mixture of residential and institutional, was destroyed when the Guild House was destroyed. We have the same issue in the next block. So understanding this need for a residential scale along Stockley Gardens, I believe, this is a guess now, but an educated guess, I believe, as part of a process with the Ghent Neighborhood League, will produce a solution. But we need to respect this provision, or we're not going to get anywhere with it. So those are the constraints. This is what one of them looks like. We did a test of what we could do. You asked about the footprint as it is now. It's about 53% now. It's a little bit less than that, excuse me. We could, within the 55%, be able to add a 2,000 square foot footprint, which we've illustrated here just as a circulation element to get elevators and stairs and connect the parts of the building and make a new entrance and connect into Lloyd Hall. So that's one option. However, if we look back to what the building coverage was like when the Guild House was there, we get a 58% coverage. And I think we can make an argument that that is the coverage we should be doing, because the interest is in restoring that character. That leads us then to this diagram, which shows what we can add with the replacement of Lloyd Hall and what the additional square footage for a variance would be to get us back to 58%. And the requirement would be this. I don't know that it has to look exactly like the Guild House, but maybe it looks like the image that was in that 1947 proposal of something that has a residential character. So we've not had conversations. The client, which is the parish, is always the first to hear all this. So we've not had conversations with the city yet, but we will shortly. So this is an idea. And the suggestion is that it all be built at the level of the parish house. It's built north of Lloyd Hall, so construction could start and Lloyd Hall could continue operating during it. And the space between Lloyd Hall and the property can become handicap parking, service access, and other things on that. Now, you remember I said you can't build below the level of the parish house? It's possible. This may or may not be feasible to use the space underneath for parking, because parking is a permitted use in an area that gets flooded.
They do that in Charleston all the time.
Charleston, they do, right. So we don't know it's going to work, but it's a direction that we can pursue. And the suggestion only a beginning suggestion, is that the new wing have the main entry, offices up here in a residential setting, children's program, hospitality, and meeting rooms, and that the parish house be converted to uses that support the worship space, with the top floor restoring some of the high ceilings, creating a sort of chapel-like space up there as the music rehearsal room in that area, so that you have a building that's an organized way associated with worship support and all the community functions in the other wing. We looked a little bit at cost, and we know that that little connection is $1.5 million, and it's probably another $1 million if you were to do major restoration of this building and in the parish house. So that's a $3 million investment, using a very generous budget, but I think realistic when you come to total costs. A new wing of 14,500, 15,000 square feet is about $4.5 million as a program. And typically, that's a kind of capital project that parishes this size can manage. Obviously, there's a long way to go before we get there.
Just before you go on, these two scenarios up on the screen are alternatives, they're not stages.
No, they're not stages.
These are alternatives.
Well, we did discuss doing it in stages. You could do it in stages. You're probably adding good 40%, 50% to the cost, total ultimate cost of it. And plus, think about having two capital campaigns, one after another, which
No,
would...
I just wanted to make that clear.
Good, thank you. Now, of course, there are other issues to be dealt with in a master plan, and we're only focusing on this today. But the use of this of the green and how to best have it serve the interests of the church is something we've talked a lot about. We moved away from having any facilities over there, even in the short term, because of this need to get everybody this sort of sense of community being the overriding criterion for it. Obviously, there's an organ program underway, and there's other restoration projects. But we're not talking about something that's going to happen tomorrow. There's a process we have to go through. We're going to continue to talk. We'll take all of your input. We'll get some more. We need to engage the community in the city. We need to establish a project oversight committee to manage this as a project. We need to find the right professionals. We thought we might be able to begin a detailed planning process next year. At least that would be one possibility. And then we could develop designs and budgets, maybe by the end of spring or end of summer of 2015, then go through financial feasibility, and then maybe begin to get into the more detailed aspects of planning in 2016. Now, the reason I wanted to do this first, before we do the short-term list, is that we've come to the conclusion that something like this is the most responsible use of church resources, rather than trying to continue to apply Band-Aids to where we are. So, your assignment is to look at your facilitator. We'll have a drawing for you. Like to know what you like best about this possibility, what do you like least about it, and what worries you, and what are the most important things for us to keep in mind. We'd like to get a sense from the group of where you're going. Here's a hand right here.
Well, I think that in our parish there still is some level of disgust or bad feelings or horror or whatever you want to call it about the old, the previous project that went to dust. I, for one, like this idea, and I think if we're going to move forward at all, short-term stuff or whatever, we need to put the nail in that last project and say, we're done with it and that we're going to do this. And I think before we can do that, we're going to show of hands to see if this group agrees to that. And if so, then they can work on short-term stuff. We have a master plan, or at least a concept that we're all behind. And I would move that. Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Great. Okay. So please keep your papers. One more painful assignment to do, and that is to now focus on a short-term list. I did describe to you earlier some of the particular problems and issues that we have in the existing building that can be dealt with, because it's a couple years before we move forward with a plan. Let's just look at the floors and the lighting in the church, the improvement of the sacristy area, adding a handrail and other things for the stair, doing cosmetic improvements to the bathroom. Consider a flat screen video thing, which could be moved to a new facility for here, so that while people are doing one thing in here, setting up, they can watch the services and deal with the entrances. Just to clarify that issue, there's a list which you have in front of you, and I wanted to give you just a couple images. This is that infamous stair, and you'll see there is a railing in the middle, which is very discontinuous. There's nothing around the outside going up, and this is the cramped space into which the flower guild and the vesting and some of the sacristy takes place. There are a couple options that we've discussed with flower guild and sacristy about accommodating it in other places. That can be a short-term project. Within the church itself, here are the famous squishy floors in the front where there once were pews. They're actually becoming a hazard, and it's because the floor underneath is collapsing, and there's a proposal to replace that wood with tile that works well with the existing tile since it's circulation space. There are a few within the grandeur of our church. There's some backstage equipment which very few people except the choir gets to see, but now really I think we might want to find a better way of providing that lighting. And this is an attempt to illustrate the infamous dark spot where the performers are. These are all relatively small scale projects. We also have on the upper floor, in some conversations about the children's program, the need to think about another classroom space by combining these two existing spaces, which have a tiny little hallway, into something, working with the storeroom up there, adding some cribs, improving the upper floor of Lloyd Hall here just enough so that we can add another meeting room to it. So that's the list. You have it in front of you. If you think there's some things missing from this short-term list, let us know. Are there things you don't think need to be done? And what are the 10 most important things to do? And then your assignment is over.
We are going to conclude our formal part, and you can stay and just fill out your sheet, and you can leave it up here by the projector, and we will process it. So the formal part of the meeting is now ending. But I want to thank all of you for your commitment in spending so much time here. And again, I want to thank Ray and his team for their tremendous work. I also want to give you some feedback. I want to give you some feedback just for 1 minute. A couple years ago, I invited the Ghent Business Association to meet here at Christ in St. Luke's, which is, as many of you know, is comprised of the owners of businesses and branch businesses and in this area, and also managers. At the last Ghent Business Association meeting this past Thursday, one of the people got up and said, "I want, on behalf of the Ghent business, want to thank Christ in St. Luke's for what you are doing in terms of beautifying the neighborhood." He said, "I was driving down the street to the meeting, and he said, I've never seen this place look as beautiful, and, quote unquote, you are an asset to this community." So I thought that was a wonderful statement for what we're doing, and wanted to leave you with that benediction.